Hello, very beautiful community. Mr. Trump has put up a photo of Mr. Putin in the White House, and many commentators across the West are aghast. This is Elizabeth Landers from PBS. I noticed in the vestibule area that connects the West Wing to the residence, a framed photo of Trump and Putin at the Alaska summit. Here's the photo in closer up. And this is The Guardian being told by the White House that the Alaska summit was a historic moment that helped bring Ukraine and Russia, whose brutal war was brought on by Joe Biden's incompetence, closer to a deal. End of quote. This is one of the many accomplishments that President Trump chooses to feature at the White House. And then we have Mr. Kirill Dmitriev saying, good, a picture that's worth 1,000 words. So I don't want to stop reheating the old cabbage of narcissism and ideological overlap between Trump and Putin in general, but I do want to stop reheating it for the purpose of this video. Because it's very important cabbage to reheat, but that's not where I want to go today. I want to ask a question about Trump's impact on history. Whether this photo of Putin, maybe a photo of Putin without Trump, would have got to the White House anyway, would have been put up on the wall in the White House if Trump never existed. And I suppose that's a question about America's descent into authoritarianism and the connections of that with Trump's personality. And there is a very important abstract question that is not just abstractly interesting here, because the abstract question has a direct impact on how we understand the interaction of particular individuals, particular post-truth authoritarians that might come to power in our country, and the general historical trend. In other words, if we pressed a magic button and all the current post-truth authoritarians circling power became fishermen in Thailand and gardeners in England, would the world be a better place? How much of a better place? For how long? In other words, would their places be immediately reconstituted by others because there's a historical trend here that we can't stop, even if we magically incentivize all the baddies in politics to immediately change profession? I think that the reason this is an important question is that when we talk about politics, we're talking about relations between human beings that are mediated by institutions which they share, mediated by political culture, mediated by all sorts of things that aren't present in personal life. And that's why relations you have with people in your personal life are partly a good model for understanding politics, but partly just don't extend to politics as a useful analogy, because political relations are specially mediated in this way by institutions and other things. And that's an important thing for us to watch out for. But it doesn't follow from that political relationships, human beings that relate to one another via political institutions and other mediating items, that they are somehow simply relations controlled by social forces in which individuals don't matter. Now, there are several very rich schools of thought throughout the history of the West which minimize the role of individual agency in history. So let's try to frame this a little bit clearly for ourselves in the abstract, and I'm so sorry if I bore the life out of you when I do that. So I'm going to put my cards down straight away and make a recommendation that you then need to go away and think about for yourself and arrive at your own judgment, right? Don't just put it into yourself and say, that's what I'm going to think. But my recommendation is actually that individuals matter enormously in history. But what kind of a claim is that? Because simply to say that individuals make a big difference in history isn't actually going to send off many Marxists who are convinced that individuals don't matter all that much away, feeling intellectually defeated. Because the Marxists will just say, of course, individuals matter. They're the agents who deliver, right, the consequences of historical forces. So just saying individuals matter isn't going to be enough. So what do we need to say? I think we need to say that individuals affect major historical events. The opponents of the power of the individual in history are not going to deny that 4 or 5 people changed the speed limit in the city center of Norwich 20 years ago. Right? They're going to deny that. They're going to deny something bigger, something to do with the causes of the Second World War, the Russian Revolution. So we need to say that individuals influence big events. More importantly, we need to say that individuals influence big events in a distinctive way. That's to say, it's not a kind of influence that would have been exerted by somebody else in place of that individual if that individual weren't there. So it has to be a distinctive inflection of history. And then thirdly, major, distinctive, and thirdly, it's got to be a major and distinctive inflection of history that is reasonably well connected with the intentional states of individuals. Because it's possible that the way individuals influence history is by making a change that's about an intervention which then leads to consequences the individual had absolutely no idea and no intention to generate. So if every time an individual makes a distinctive and major contribution in history, they aim to blow up a party balloon and end up making a potato salad, if that's what happens, that's not quite an account of the rich role of the intentional states of individuals in the historical process. So you actually want a situation where the individual sets out to make a potato salad and makes it. Well, we can see such influences all over history, I would argue. Just to take one example, in many ways, Mr. Gorbachev, in power at the end of the Soviet project, wanted to keep that project by radically reforming it and remodeling it on a certain kind of ex-Soviet space version of the European Union. The problem is that the ex-Soviet countries that sought independence wouldn't have wanted to quite be in that kind of project with Russia. And many other problems too. But nevertheless, Gorbachev was extremely committed to the notion that certain things are simply not to happen. For instance, keeping the project going by use of mass terror, violence, and force. Force was used, violence occurred, but we're talking about the preservation of that project that would have probably been attempted by Gorbachev's predecessors, right, by means he didn't use. So there's a big continuity there between the kind of outcome that we witnessed and the kind of intentional states the particular agent at hand had. So I believe that this delivers a very, very important victory for the view that individuals are enormously influential. One of the problems, by the way, that the view that individuals don't matter has is with the arts. Because when the question arises, would somebody else have written Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata if he hadn't done it? The answer can't be yes, somebody else would have written it, unless you really are having a very severe mental health crisis. It's a completely insane thing to say. And so that certain kind of Marxist needs to then argue one of two things. Either that somebody else would have written a very similar sonata that did similar sorts of things with fugal writing, whatever, or that no great work of art can ever be a major historical event, and therefore they don't count, and therefore we can allow that nobody would have done what Beethoven did. And neither of these positions are convincing. So having allowed ourselves this detour, let's come back to Trump. Trump is not the central causal driver of US authoritarianism. He is much more the delivery vehicle for something that already pre-existing historical forces are pushing on. Indeed, while if I were a US citizen, I probably wouldn't even say this on the main channel because this is, I really don't want to impact you like that. But if I were a US citizen, I would have very clearly voted for Kamala Harris. I would have been enormously disappointed with Kamala Harris's candidacy, but I would have gone out of my way to vote for her. Why? Because I think about politics in short blocks of time, because that's primarily where we have to start. And so there's no question that the West wouldn't have been disintegrating the way it is, and all kinds of calamitous things wouldn't have been happening in the United States the way they are happening if Kamala Harris were in power. But if we ask the following question, is it a Kamala Harris or a Trump presidency that's more likely to lead to the United States being an authoritarian country in 2040? The answer to that question is we don't know. Because you can't disconnect one thing from another and from another in a historical chain. So it's entirely possible that something slightly better happens after Trump relative to what would have happened after Kamala Harris. It's also possible that the continuation of a very roughly centrist, technocratic, partly neoliberal politics would have been harmful, because that's the sort of politics that caused Trump in the first place. So the answer is we don't know. My recommendation would be to think that not just for these 4 years, during which Trump is obviously 27 times more destructive than Kamala Harris, but over the next 15 years or so, that Trump's impact would be the more damaging one, because Trump acts as a disinhibiting and accelerating force. And some of that stuff you just can't put back in the box. So I'm going to say that 8 or 9 times out of 10, we get to a worse place with Trump by 2040. But even that, we can't know, right? A lot of things that are 2 out of 10 end up happening. Right? So the trend is there, with or without Trump. And if anything, as I say, Trump is a warm-up act for the harder-nosed authoritarianism to come. But I don't believe that translates to the picture. In other words, not only now, if Kamala Harris had been in power, we certainly wouldn't have a picture of Putin in the White House, but even in the 2030s, it's less likely that we'll have a picture of Putin in the White House, because that picture is largely there not because Trump is an authoritarian of a certain kind, but because he is an authoritarian with a very overt narcissistic personality challenge. Take away that challenge, probably that picture doesn't end up there. And if we think of the authoritarians of the 2030s on a pessimistic prognosis as knowing what they're doing a bit better than Trump does, then we can assume that it'd be less likely that they're going to be deeply moved by a photo opportunity with a leader on whom they depend for narcissistic supply. So it's still possible, but it's less likely. And so cartoonishly, the conclusion to this video is no Trump, no Putin picture, but no Trump, still the authoritarian trend persists, which can, of course, be slowed by a national, mobilizing counter project centering on democratic and economic exclusion and distrust that citizens feel, driven by a commitment to the values of the public good and solidarity, and a recognition not just of the calamitousness of post-truth authoritarianism, but of the danger of the persistence of the centrist technocracy that's in part brought us to where we are today. If that kind of project appears, and it's unlikely that the Dems can produce it in the United States, but it's possible, that would very significantly slow democratic decline in the United States and would perhaps reduce the odds of the collapse of US democracy from whatever they might be today. Let's cartoonishly guess 70% in the 2030s to 20%. That's still doable. It's unlikely that it gets done, but it's still doable. Lots of love and talk very soon.